Hi, hello everyone. So last time we left off with basically our quad, which we colored, and this time we're going to cover texturing. And you can already see some important information about textures here. So this is our text texture that I'm going to use. I have already added it to assets in the text texture, and I'll provide download link in the description of the video. But here you can see this texture coordinates, right, for each vertex. So you can already see that this 0, 1 corresponds to this vertex here, 1, 1 to here, then we have 0, 1, 0 and 0, 0 here. So we're going to need those. And before I cover the creation of textures, let's just finish these texture coordinates that we're going to need in the future. So if I go to unlit material shader, so how do we paste them? Well, we're going to paste them similar to like our position set colors. I'm going to say location 2, not normal, it's actually texture coords. Texture coords. I can just call it texture coord, that's fine. It's of type vector 2, and we're also going to need it here as well as our output. And here we're just going to say, and for now we're not going to need them. We're going to need them when we cover how when we actually paste the texture. So we're going to need to sample those basically edges, but let's just go further. So in our geometry we can actually paste those texture coords, and it's similar, right? 432 array, new 432 array. They're not going to be optional though. So in our geometry builder, let's just say let text coords, and we can create them. So we had here bottom left, and bottom left, if you take a look at the text coordinates here, it's 0, 0 at bottom left, but it's actually going to be 0, 1 because in our case it's reversed, right? No? No. Anyway, if it doesn't work, we're just going to flip the y coordinates. So let's go like here, here, here. So we just need to paste them for each of the vertices, and then in our geometry buffer we finally need to create our texture coords buffer, and right after colors we can say texture coords x texture coords buffer is the y-scape buffer label. You can paste it, so size is from our texture coords, right? And this is similar, it's for vertex, copy destination, and then we need to write to that buffer. So similar as before, we're just going to paste the data in and then the byte length as well. So that covers it in, and in our unlit render pipeline, we just need to paste it. Set vertex buffer, location was 2, and then we pass this texture coordinates buffer. Here it's complaining, it's not nullable. So I think that covers it. There is some error here. Maybe I did something wrong. Aha, I forgot. We need to do also describe them here, buffer layout, right? So we're going to push that. Array stride was 2, and then attributes shade location 2, offset was 0, 432 times 2, and that covers it. Okay, now it works. Now we know that we're pasting that correctly. So that covers that part where we paste the texture coordinates. The other important part is texture itself, right? So let's get to it. And for that, I'm going to do it like this. So where to start first? Well, at first, I think I'm going to start. Okay, what have I done? I think I'm going to start with shader. Actually, so if you go to our unlit shader, so we're going to need to describe some stuff here. So I'm going to say it like this. Just type this out and I'm going to explain it later. Binding 0. And then we're going to say here, or diffuse texture, type texture 2D, F32. and then we're also going to have wrong this group again, but at binding 0, sorry, at binding 1, we're going to have our diffuse text sampler and this of type sampler. And so here we're just going to say texture sample, diffuse diffuse texture, diffuse texture sampler, and then we had our this text coordinates. All right. So I need to explain some stuff here. So this group 0 binding 0 is just sort of how we pass our location to shader, similar to this one, but it's a bit different, right? This here we're passing data per vertex, right? So that's why this is in this format, location, and here we're actually passing I would say global data, right? It's set once for shader, and then it can be used regardless of which vertex are we at. But I'm going to explain, I'm going to touch on this a bit later as well, but here this is important. We're going to have to pass texture, and we're going to pass sampler, right? So sampler is going to, well, sample our texture. So we can get the color of texture. So how do we get a color? So let's say, take a look at maybe this pixel, right? So we had our texture coordinates. So it's going to need know according to texture coordinates, right? Where to sample. So, and then we had also our texture sample, and with texture sample we can define, for example, aliasing, what kind of aliasing to use, or what to do if our texture coordinates, like, right, we could say here 1.1, then it's out of the texture. And what do you do when you're out with the texture? Well, you define that with texture sample. So you can either repeat the texture, mirror the texture, or maybe clamp edge to some color, stuff like that. All right, so we're going to play with the texture sample, texture coordinates a bit more in the next lessons, in the next videos. But here you just need to know that it needs to be defined. So now we can actually start with our texture. So I'm just going to create new folder texture, and I'm going to call this texture 2D, and we're going to export class texture 2D. As usual, we're going to need device. We can say private device and not the texture. So we can just leave that here, and here we can actually create public. So what are we going to need? We're going to need texture. It's of type GPU texture. I'm just going to place this so it doesn't bother us. And not the view, we're going to need sampler. And it's of type GPU sample. So now we're going to create texture and sampler. All right, and for that, I guess we can start with, I'm going to just create a small method. Create texture and sampler. So we're going to need width of type number, and then height of type number. So we can paste our texture. We're using device create texture, so we need that to use that size. And here we can just paste width, height, and ignore the last argument. So format. So just for those who are not familiar with TypeScript, when you say width just like this, it also it's kind of like alias for this. So if your name here corresponds to property name, you can just say leave it like this instead. Format red, green, blue, alpha color. So 8 means it's of type byte, which is 8 bits, and then unsigned. All right, and then usage. This is kind of important. It's not going to be sample, it's going to be texture binding. And then I'm just going to break this into lines so that it's easier to see. What am I missing here? Format. This is wrong here. All right. Alright, so for these texture flags, I do recommend that you maybe look at the documentation here, but essentially we're going to cover binding, how binding works a bit later. So this copy destination means, I think it means goes from the CPU to the GPU. It can be vice versa as well, and it's going to be used for rendering, so therefore render attachment. But I do recommend maybe to just go to the documentation to look these flags up, because you kind of need to describe your textures with these flags and how are they going to be used. And then we're also going to create sampler. So I'm just going to leave it as this because we're going to cover samples a bit more in the future, but just know that you can also here say nearest and in linear, and then you also have some other arguments here as well. So this is just when, for example, nearest and linear means you have this kind of situation, right? Maybe like this. So your texture coordinate somewhere in between, and it needs to decide what to do with this pixel. So it can either select texel from here or here, depending on which one is closer if you use nearest, or linear, it means it kind of interpolates between the two. Yeah. I'll cover it in the next video, actually, a bit more, because this is going to be quite long without it. So we're just going to have another method, which is going to be public async. Does it need to be async? Yeah, it needs to be async initialize. And here we're just going to paste our image element. So what did we do here? Well, we created a texture, right? But we never assigned any data to it. So we're going to do that now. So we can just create texture and sampler. We're going to paste image with image height. So how do we paste the data here? So we're going to need image bitmap, which is kind of bytes from the image. And then we can just say our device, Q, copy external image to texture. So the first argument is data. It's object that takes source, and it's our image bitmap. Then we need the texture. So texture that we're writing to, our texture. And then the last argument is width and height. So width and height are kind of self-explanatory, so I don't need to describe it too much. And it's async because of this await. Alright, I think that's it. So we cover the texture. So further, we're going to need to our unlit render pipeline, and we're going to create something called diffuse text. Actually, I'm just going to call it texture bind group layout. And somewhere after our buffers, we're going to say this texture bind group layout is device create bind group layout. So what are the arguments here? We have our entries, and here I'm going to explain it in a second. Sampler. Alright, this layout, we're actually going to set group later, but notice this binding. We're passing the fragment shader, but this binding and this binding are kind of important because they correspond to what? Well, to our bindings here, right? We had this binding. We're going to cover group later, but just for now we're looking at bindings. And then also the type is important. Why? Because it actually needs to correspond with these types, right? We're pasting texture, and you can just set it to empty object, and here sampler as well, and you can set it to empty object. So that defines our texture bind group layout, and then we can paste it actually to this layout, but not just yet like this. So we can say layout, create pipeline layout, bind group layouts, and we're going to paste this texture bind group layout. And why is it not local variable? Well, I'm going to cover that also a bit later, but we can just say this layout here. All right. So that covers our layout. So we kind of have to describe our shader to create our pipeline, basically, right? We've done that. So here we actually need to pass. So we're going to create this now. Set bind group, and this is what's going to set our bind group. So for the texture, we still don't have a bind group. We're going to create that now, So I'm just going to say diffuse texture bind group, and I'm going to create it now. But this bind group, right, will correspond to this group and this group, right? So that's how you organize the data that needs to be pasted. And so for our bind group, I'm just going to say private diffuse texture bind group, and we need to actually create that bind group. So somewhere over here, we can create a new private method. We can say create texture bind group. Sorry for this. So we're going to need device, and then here I can paste texture 2D. So we can say return device create bind group, and here notice layout. So we need to paste this layout that we have defined here. All right. So we now paste the data into our bind group. So our bind group will hold that data that we're passing to the shader. So at our binding 0 is our texture, and we use actually from the texture, right? This is GPU texture. We use create view, and that creates a view into our texture. And then for the sampler, we just paste the sampler. And notice these bindings, right? They correspond exactly to these bindings here and in the shader as well. So actually that covers passing the bind group. Okay, that's cool. And the last step is actually we need to define our texture. So here we're just going to say diffuse texture. I'm going to do this actually. So we're going to have public set diffuse texture. It's going to have setter. Why? Because we need to actually create that bind group from the texture. So we can just assign the texture, and then we can actually create that bind group. And here we're just going to paste this device. And actually I need to make it private. And since it's private, actually I'll just modify this a bit. Because we can say here this device, right? This, and then let's go back to our setter. Exactly, we create whenever we change the texture, right, that we're going to use for our pipeline, we need to create a new bind group, right, because that bind group is using texture data. So just be mindful of that. And here it's actually not that even important. And we did set the bind group, so this is texture. I think we're almost done. I just need to go to main and actually use the texture. So we're going to do it like this. Let's see. How am I going to do it? Actually, I might create a small helper function here. I'm going to call it load image. It's just going to be way more convenient to use it. And here we're just going to say image, new image. So this is how to load image in JavaScript. We're going to paste path, and then actually what I want to do is return new promise, resolve, reject. Oh, my bad, I missed some key. We can, on error, we can just reject, and I think that covers it. Alright, I forgot here. Alright, I mean JavaScript API is but unusual. It's similar to C# task or something like that. But essentially, since this is async, right? So we're fetching resources synchronously. So onload is going to be called when it's ready, and then by using resolve image, we're saying, okay, this is now resolved and you can continue, and that allows us to use this async in the wait. And just so that we know what we're returning, it's promise and type is HTML image element, right, which we resolved here. It's actually image, not image element. But that's actually interface, so we're going to say this, and then we can actually load it. It's not assets texture, it's called, and let's just say here image is await. Load image test texture, and then it's a JPEG. All right, and now we can actually finally use it. And I'm actually going to do it like this: const diffuse texture, this new texture 2D. We're going to need device, and then we can paste the data in, and then we can finally set it to our pipeline. I think that's mostly it, so pay attention to this. And of course we have a bug here, so I haven't covered this, but I think it's kind of important. If maybe you don't have this, but I would recommend checking for WebGPU debug tools, and it's kind of Chrome extension. So if I would just to look for WebGPU debug tools, yeah, it's this one. I would recommend installing it in Chrome, WebGPU dev tools. So you can check it here. If I reset this, I might get an error, and I can see it here. Expected. So I missed something. All right, it's a syntax error. Let's see in our shader. I missed something somewhere. Okay, here we're multiplying this, and now it works. Sort of. Our texture is not showing for some reason. Let's see, what did I miss? I missed something. We create our texture, we paste our data in. Did I not use it correctly? We paste our diffuse texture, omit pipeline, set binding group. Alright, I just realized what's wrong. If you take a look at our geometry builder, I created texture coords, but I never paste them in. So let's do that. And that kind of covers it. Alright, that works perfect. And now these colors are different because, right, we're multiplying by colors from our color buffer. So we're just going to set all of this to white, and then it should be fine. And as you can see, that works. All right, we're almost there. One last step that I want to do is actually go back to our texture, and let's just simplify some stuff. I'm going to create public static create, and here we can just paste our device and then our image, and it's going to be async. It's just going to simplify API a bit. So we can create our texture, initialize it, and then return it. It just simplifies our API a bit so that it won't have to do this middle step. So we can just await here texture 2D, then use create device image, and it works all the same. So we can also just paste it here as well. Just makes it a bit more readable, I think. And also, what I like to do if we don't ever set this texture, right? I love to have kind of empty texture. So let's cover in our texture 2D. Let's just cover creating of empty texture. So we're going to say public static async create empty. So here we're just going to need device, and here instead of this initialize, we're just going to say public async initialize from data. So we're going to need data, and I think this data can be of type array buffer. We're going to need width, we're going to need height, and then it's kind of similar, almost there. Well, let me just see this. I don't agree with this data, how it is passed in. So the texture is fine, but then the second parameter is data. The third one is not important, this data layout, and the fourth one can be just our width and height. Pay attention, there are 4 parameters here. So it's kind of similar like this copy external image to texture, but we just used write texture instead. If we already have our data in, right? And it's of type sign buffer or array buffer. We paste it in. So the first parameter is the texture that's receiving the data, then the data. This layout we don't care about too much, and then we just paste width and height. So here in create empty, it's going to be similar to the first one, but we're going to wait initials from data, and here I'm just going to do this new uint 8 array, and here I'm just going to paste 255 255 255 for white. So red, green, blue, alpha, all are 255 or fully white, and then 1 on 1. So what am I doing here? Well, whenever I want just to have some place called the empty texture, I usually just create 1 by 1 texture, 1 pixel width, 1 height, and I assign white to it, so it doesn't mess our colors in shader calculation, and that's it basically. So I'm just going to return it here, and then in our unlit render pipeline, somewhere at the end of the initialize, I love to do this. This diffuse texture is equal, and then I'm just going to say texture 2D create empty, and I probably need to await it. No, it's of type promise. It actually doesn't need to be async in this case because we already have the data. Yeah, it doesn't need to be async here, so that's fine. So let's just go down only train the pipeline. Still kind of presents it as async. It's not though. So I'm just going to say here texture 2D. Aha, my bad. You need to remove the async here, so it just returns the texture 2D. In our unlit render pipeline, we can create empty one as default. So if I don't assign it here, it should work. It works. All right, that's basically it for this video. I know it's kind of long and not so easy to pass the textures in, but that's the way it is. So just to recap, you usually need to handle it in shader, right? So you're going to need texture coordinates, then you're going to need texture 2D and sampler. So you're going to need to pass these addresses. I'll call them addresses here. It's kind of a layout address thing ID. But then you just need texture to get text. Well, basically texel from the texture, right? And you get it from texture. You paste sample. You paste texture coordinates. Then in our only render pipeline, you kind of had to do this with the buffer layouts, right? You're passing that for texture coordinates. You need to create texture bind group layout, right? To describe these layouts, how are they used? You just paste them in. That's quite all right. And then the other important thing is whenever you have actually texture, right? Whenever you have created this texture and sample, you need to create a new bind group layout and paste that texture and sample in, and then you just use them. All right, that's it for this video. In the next video, we're actually going to learn how to paste this global data. So again, we're going to be using this buying groups and buying groups layout. So hopefully by the next time, you will get hang of it. It's not too hard once you get used to it. It's a bit unusual, but not too hard. All right, that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe, and until next time.